Print journalism can no longer compete with online sources of information. I've decided to split my argument into two main parts today. The first part being that the physical circulation of information through newspapers has decreased in recent years. The second part of my argument is that access to information through technology, such as social media, has increased over recent years. So to begin with, in 2012, the OECD concluded that access to information through newspapers has decreased worldwide. Now, this is a very substantial statement. We need to think about it from a developed country's perspective and then a less developed country's perspective. In a more developed country's perspective, such as the UK's or the US's, access to technologies such as iPads and laptops and smartphones is very prevalent. Whereas in less developed countries, there is a lower level of access to that technology. It's interesting to see that the same statistics are occurring within both countries, that information through physical sources is being replaced through electronic sources. If this is happening in less developed countries, it surely means there's been a substantial transition in the dissemination of information. And the second part of my first argument is specifically for more developed countries. In the US, ad revenue for physical circulation of newspapers has decreased massively over recent years. For instance, in 2003, it was valued to be somewhere around $44,900 million, whereas in 2012, it was valued to be $18,900 million. And we can see that the online revenue that these companies are earning is not increasing substantially in comparison. So really, these big original sources of information, these big newspapers such as the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, are actually losing their market share upon the advent of the internet. Which takes me on to the second part of my argument, that online sources of information are more so becoming the social media streams. For instance, if we look at companies like Facebook that are now worth somewhere around $150 billion, that's in comparison to the New York Times, which is now worth only $2.5 billion. Even Instagram in 2012 was worth more than New York Times, which has recently been purchased by Facebook. And these are really interesting statistics because it shows that there's been a huge transition in the way that people access information. Today, I would perhaps look more so to my Facebook newsfeed for up-and-coming news stories, to my Twitter feed for up-and-coming news stories, than I would going down to the shops and buying a physical newspaper. And I think if the younger generations are definitely looking in this way, then there's only really one way that physical newspapers can go, and that's migrating onto the internet. So we've seen over recent years that news sources such as the New York Times have moved on to the internet and have been providing a few articles to people free of charge. For instance, the New York Times now has roughly 12 million followers on Twitter, which is an impressive figure and is much larger than the height of their circulation historically. However, we do have to put these types of figures into perspective. A company such as Instagram now has 32 million followers in comparison. So if we think about that in perspective, then obviously we can recognize that social media is steaming ahead of these kind of companies. Now that's interesting. I honestly think that the future of access to information is technological, and I think that it's coming from different sources rather than the original newspapers. Rather than your kind of companies like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, people are deciding to access information from individuals who are perhaps blogging or perhaps tweeting or perhaps contributing to their Facebook newsfeed, which I think is a really interesting change. And I think overall it means that these kind of companies who produce physical newspapers are specifically going to have to cut back on their physical newspapers, and they're going to have to look at different ways of migrating onto the internet. So I definitely think over the next few years there's going to be a huge change and a lot smaller, a lot fewer number of physical sources of information being available as more and more of this technology becomes available. Now I think if we look towards developed countries where I began this argument, if we look to less developed countries where I began this argument, and the kind of level of technology that's now becoming available there, if we look to sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, there's quite a few smartphone devices moving around. You can see companies like Samsung producing very, very cheap smartphone devices. We know that if this process is already happening in such countries, it's only going to happen more so. So if we look into the future, I honestly think within 50 to 100 years' time, there probably won't be any physical sources of newspapers. So to conclude, this is definitely happening. We're definitely seeing kind of end times to physical newspapers, but I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. So thank you for watching, and I hope for your feedback. And I now need to cut this end bit, which is good. Don't know my password.